Okay, I think. Okay. So a warm welcome to everybody here, and definitely a warm welcome to Professor Rob Kitchin. He really doesn't need any introduction at all. Anybody who's engaged with digital geography has started off with reading him, but then I have been given the sort of duty to sort of introduce him. So Professor Kitchin is currently a professor at Maynooth University and is the director of Maynooth University Social Sciences Institute. His research mostly focuses on the production of digital geographies. He's the co-author and co-editor of 32 academic books and co-author over 200 articles and book chapters. He was the founder and past editor of one of the most influential journals, Dialogues in Human Geography, a past editor of also Progress in Human Geography, and a founder and past editor of Social and Cultural Geography, 3 immensely influential journals. He was the editor-in-chief of 12 volumes of International Encyclopedia of Human Geography, and is an editor of 2 book series, Irish Society and Key Concepts in Geography. He's a regular media commentator and has given invited talks in over 25 countries to over 30 disciplines. He was the 2013 recipient of the Royal Irish Academy's Gold Medal for Social Sciences. His research sort of spans over multiple areas, from software, big data, smart cities, to internet and cyberspace, from cartographic theory, mapping and dashboards, to islands, social geography, housing and spatial planning, to diaspora strategies and migration, to disability issues, to cognitive mapping and relationship between geography and psychology. 3 of his recent books have been on the data revolution, a critical approach to big data, open data, and data infrastructures, data lives, how data are made and shape our world, and slow computing, why we need balanced digital lives. And lastly, it's not really surprising somehow, given his prolific academic writings, he is also author of 4 novels and 2 collections of short stories. He has published greatly these short stories, and he's a regular contributor on blogging connected with crime fiction. So today he's going to speak on exploring digital space and time. Over to you, Professor Kitchin, and thank you so much for taking the time out and talking to us here. We look forward to learning a great deal from your lecture. Thank you so much.
That's great. Thank you very much for the introduction. I've got a lot to live up to on the basis of that introduction. Yeah, so thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. I was kind of asked to maybe do something a little bit kind of high level around digital geographies rather than talk on something specific. So I'm going to talk around the notion of exploring digital space-time, and really to look at the kind of relationship between space and time, but really to put the focus onto time itself as a kind of a focus for study in relation to digital geography. Can you see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can see your screen.
Yeah, it's all right. I've got kind of I can kind of see multiple things for some reason. Okay, so I thought I'd start briefly with a kind of a little look at kind of networked urbanism, because the intersection of the digital and the city has been going on for a long time now, really since the invention of the digital. So going back, and I should apologize, I'm really going to talk about the global north because that's my area of specialism. I'll do little bits for elsewhere, but really I'm going to focus on where I know best. So we can go back into the 1950s to first look at kind of digital technologies being kind of used to understand and manage city services and infrastructures, particularly around land use transport modeling. We're starting to use kind of computation at that point. And by the late 1960s, early 1970s, we're starting to get into kind of cybernetic thinking being applied onto cities, and organizations like the RAND Corporation working with city authorities to look at modeling the location of services and so on. And then really into the 1980s and 1990s, we start to see computation being progressively embedded into the work practices. So things like SCADA systems, so supervisory control, adaptive systems for managing city infrastructure, things like GIS starting to be adopted, things like PCs and so on becoming more common around municipal offices and so on, and databases being used to manage people. Then into the 1950s, more and more city systems are becoming networks, more reliant on computation. This is the big evolution in the internet. So e-government, e-governance systems coming along, households themselves becoming digitally connected, and people getting access to the internet. And really at that point, we start to see urban theorists really beginning to develop a kind of emerging theories around networked urbanism and how the networking of cities was changing urban regional development and patterns of urban practice. And then in 2010s, we can start to see moving towards ubiquitous and pervasive computing and the development of smart cities. So we can kind of see smart cities developing across a whole number of different domains. So there's a whole range of different kind of technologies being rolled out. So anything from governance and government, so kind of e-government systems, online transactions, city operating systems, performance management, urban dashboards, across onto centralized control rooms around security, emergency services, digital surveillance, predictive policing, coordinated emergency response, intelligent transport systems around transport, smart travel cards, bike share, real-time passenger information, logistics management, transport apps, and so on. Into energy with smart grids. So this is kind of the efficient redistribution, storage of energy, smart metering, smart lighting, into waste, into environment with sensor networks to kind of monitor what's going on an ongoing basis, build management systems, sensor networks, smart meters, various apps, and so on. And then obviously into this kind of civic, into the civic domain. So a whole range of different kinds of technologies being used in kind of the management and kind of regulation governance of city infrastructure and city services. I don't know if somebody else is, can you see this kind of red writing on your screen? This is not me, this red writing, this is somebody else. I don't know if somebody else is sharing their screen as well. I'm not sure where that's kind of coming from. And then a kind of the time scape, it's a Tenzin Nam something. The timescape of smart cities then. So, you know, all of those kind of technologies we've kind of thought about in relation to really looking at kind of urban spatiality, governance, development, and kind of what's kind of happening with the kind of the geography really of how these technologies have been changing kind of urban regional patterns of development and the nature of kind of everyday urban life. But in general, there's been a kind of an absence of kind of any kind of consideration of time really, and kind of focused attention on how the temporal relations of cities are also being kind of reshaped, and there's kind of a reshaping of a kind of spatio-temporal aspects of the city. So, you know, and in some kind of work that I've been doing more recently, I've started to turn my attention to time. So kind of looking at the real timeness of smart cities, looking at the kind of the timescape of smart cities, and more recently, I've just submitted a new book called Digital Timescapes, which this kind of talk is kind of drawing on. And basically the argument I kind of make is that smart city technologies act as space-time machines. They're technologies that alter the spatio-temporal nature of cities in different ways, and they do that across different scales, from the local across into the more global, and a kind of reconfiguration of urban regional patterns of development. And they do this in a number of ways. They kind of transform the temporal rhythms of cities and how the kind of rhythm of cities kind of operate. They change the kind of the pace and the scheduling, the tempo, the way in which temporal relations are kind of locally organized and unfold. They enable kind of significant time-space compression, and they enable forms of fast urbanism. And I'm going to illustrate kind of all of those. Now, partly how I got interested in the temporal was I spent kind of 25 years looking at the spatial and the digital. And a few years ago, I had a project called the Programmable City, and we'd interviewed over 50 people in Dublin who were involved in smart city developments. And we were coding up the very first interview from one of those. And this is a quote from that first interview that we coded. And what you see in the red here are very temporal terms. So if I just read it out, it says, well, I suppose in common with most large cities, we have a traffic control center for a number of years. So our first traffic control center was built in 1987 or even 1986. It's gone through several different iterations and expansions. The latest version was considerably changed in 2013. The traffic management center itself is 24 hours, 7 days a week. It's staffed by its own control operators. At peak times, it has people from AA Roadwatch, which is the motoring organization here. We have facilities for the police and the public transport service to be here as well. So at the moment, during the run into Christmas busy time, they're in here every day. So we have somebody from the police and somebody from public transport operators. We also have our own dedicated radio station, which is broadcasting. We've got several different registers of time going on in here. We've kind of got social time, we've got temporal modalities, we've got real time, we've got peak time. There's a range of kind of things, and kind of what it makes clear is that the kind of the regulation of time and the way in which time is used as a resource is very much present in the smart city. And so we started to code up the interviews to look at the kinds of temporal relations that were being talked about, and there's a whole load of them in here. So and I'm going to talk about each of these kind of things that's on the left hand side here, the kind of the temporal rhythm cycles, temporal relations, and temporal modalities. The things in red are kind of relations that are kind of produced by the smart city. So in relation to temporal rhythms, we have kind of technologies that are impacting on working hours, on business cycles, on policy cycles, and notions of fast policy, and so on. On the technical side, product life cycles, updating, planned obsolescence, and clock time. We have kind of 24/7, by the second, by the minute, and so on. And temporal relations, I'm going to talk quite a bit about kind of how it's changed pace and tempo by accelerating kind of everyday life, how it's kind of altered the scheduling and sequencing, notions of just in time, on the fly, in real time, notions of efficiency, so becoming more productive, kind of fast tracking, better synchronization, across into time space compression. And then on temporal modalities, this is really the kind of the relationship between the past, the present, and the future, and way in which these technologies kind of modulate and shift how those kind of work. And this is a kind of a table taken from the new book, which is kind of has chapters on each of these topics of politics, policy, governance, governmentality, mobility, logistics, planning and development, and work and labour, very much focused on kind of city life, city services, city infrastructure, and so on. And in the kind of the middle column there, you can kind of see the various kinds of technologies that might be involved in that. So some of these technologies I was just talking about earlier when I was introducing the smart city. And then a kind of the related temporalities that go along in relation to that. So we can kind of look at the ways in which these technologies, say in relation to governance and governmentality, how they're involved in things like optimization, efficiency, preemption, anticipation, prediction, forecasting, particularly around kind of emergency kinds of response and so on. Then on kind of mobility and logistics, we kind of have intelligent transport systems, mobility platforms, real-time passenger information, supply chain management, and so on. And the kind of temporalities associated with that are things like time space compression, real-time, just-in-time, synchronization, efficiency, forecasting, nowcasting, and so on. Same, you can see the same kind of thing here for planning, development, and whether it's work and labor, and so on. But time is very much the kind of taking advantage or using time as a resource, or the way in which those temporal relations get shifted kind of alters our experience and our understanding of kind of city life, our temporal kind of experiences of how we interact with the city. So if we think about those in relation to temporal rhythms, cities are very rhythmic kinds of things, from rush hour, working hours, the nighttime economy, the kind of going to school, coming back from school, so kind of opening hours. So, there's a whole kind of set of kind of timetables, scheduling, kind of a sense of rhythm of how the city kind of moves and flows and how things kind of happen. And it's a very polyrhythmic. So there's lots of these rhythms going on simultaneously. And what we generally are trying to do is create rhythmic systems. So we want systems that are kind of harmonious and stable, that they're kind of the rhythm is as we expect it to be, or as we wish it to be. We don't want arrhythmic systems where things get out of their pattern. So things like congestion or delays on trains or buses and so on, they throw out the rhythms of the city and so on. So what kind of smart city tech is often trying to do is harmonize and synchronize the kind of temporal rhythms of sets of actors, of various practices, of various processes, of various services, the way in which infrastructures kind of work and so on. And control rooms are ways in which this kind of happens. So, control rooms actively manage the temporal rhythms of the city and enact new forms of governmentality. Control rooms kind of work to limit arrhythmia and try to produce rhythmic systems that kind of maintain a refrain. So a refrain is a kind of consistent set of rhythms. And so we can kind of talk about the idea that the algorithms within the control room act as algorithms, that they're designed to create a particular kind of rhythmic refrain, or this particular kind of rhythm. And so, these traffic control rooms are trying to synchronize the flow of vehicles. And these kind of pictures you can see are of various kinds of control rooms designed to do these kinds of things. The one in the top right is probably the most famous. It's the control room in Rio de Janeiro, part of their kind of smart city development. It runs 24/7. It has 400 people working there. It's pulling in the real-time data from 32 city agencies and 12 concession companies, which are generally transport and energy companies. And it's trying to monitor what's going on in the city in real time, and to react and respond to that, and to keep the city kind of flowing, and to address any kind of emergencies and so on. And kind of what's going on here is a kind of a shift in governmentality is happening here. This isn't about discipline and self-discipline. This is about modulation. This is about being kind of corralled and compelled to act in certain ways. You can only move through the traffic system as the traffic lights allow you to do. You still have agency to be able to turn left and right and make decisions about the route, but you don't over how the traffic light system works and your you're queuing and phasing going through them. You're compelled to act in a particular kind of way. And so you have these kinds of systems. So this is the traffic control room in Dublin. So you've got the control room down in the bottom right-hand corner here. The screen in the middle is the software, the SCAT software for altering the phasing of individual junctions and the how long cars have to wait to go through the junction. The loops on the road up here are tar loops on the road. They're inductive loops, and they're basically counting the cars going across and the speed the cars are going across. There's also 380 of these high definition CCTV cameras. There's another kind of 100 traffic radar cameras. There's the buttons you press at the traffic lights to interrupt the phasing. There's information that comes in from social media of people saying there's been a traffic accident at this particular point and so on. There's the information, there's the buses on the network. So the system knows the real-time location of the 1,000 buses on the network. It also knows where all the trams are, which is the yellow dots, where the trains are. And then it feeds out that information through the radio stations and through the real-time passenger information signs at the bus stops and at the train stations, tram stops, and so on. So this is a system designed to try and create eurythmic kind of system. And the phasing changes all the time. So I could drive up to the traffic lights and wait 50 seconds, and 5 minutes later I might wait 56 seconds, and 5 minutes after that I might wait 48 seconds. It's constantly altering the phasing to try and keep the traffic moving as best as possible. So it's very much a real-time system. Okay, so that's kind of managing the rhythms. Then if we kind of think about our own kind of scheduling and pace and tempo of everyday life, we kind of have networked kind of mobile technologies, particularly things like smartphones. They provide tools to mediate our space-time trajectories and kind of alter our constraints around our everyday movements. So, the embedding of GPS into cars, into phones, into other technologies, and then the spatial media on the top, so the apps that use that kind of location data, they create new tools for managing spatial behavior. And so movement and location become increasingly open to real-time nudge, to surveillance, and to forms of digital discipline and control. And they can have pronounced effects on individual time geographies into the smart city, producing kind of more faster, more temporally flexible subjects. It used to be that when I wanted to meet my family, 15 odd years ago, I would say, I'm going to meet you at this clock tower at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I would basically have to be there, and I'd have no way of contacting anybody to say my train has been delayed, or my bus has been delayed, or my car's broken down. They would just have to wait until I turned up. Whereas now I'll often travel into the city with saying, I'll just phone you when I get there. We'll work out where we both are, and then we'll try and find each other. Or, we let things become a lot more flexible and open-ended, both temporally and spatially, rather than having these kind of fixed kind of temporal regimes. So we kind of have this kind of time shifting going on, where activities that used to be undertaken in unavailable time slots can become available. So dead time becomes productive time. So I can kind of work on the train. I can be connected to Wi-Fi. I can be sending emails. I can be sat on a plane 5 miles up in the sky and be sending emails and doing Skype calls and doing other kinds of work. I can be sat at the bus stop marking online essays and so on. So people become this kind of always everywhere available. There's several different tasks can be performed simultaneously rather than sequentially. I can multitask, or I can interleave activities together, and I can become a lot more kind of flexible. So activities become decoupled from clock time. So this is the notion of kind of network time rather than clock time. So I can kind of do on the fly scheduling. I can have serendipitous encounters when my phone can tell me, oh, by the way, your friend is within 100 meters away you are. Do you want to connect with them? Or it will tell me location-based services. It will say, I can ask it about where's the nearest coffee shop, or it will tell me, such and such a restaurant is around the corner, and so on. So tasks can be undertaken in situ, they can be done on the fly, they can be done in real time. And it also means that they're now kind of set times. So things like meal times, clocking in, clocking out, timetables, pre-arranged meetings, which were built around the clock, can be traded for greater temporal flexibility and taking advantage of network time and so on. And it kind of enables a kind of a speeding up. So these kind of technologies, because they're designed to be more efficient and to optimize kind of work and to make things kind of quicker and easier to do, they kind of speed up the pace and the tempo of everyday life. Now, ironically, one of the things that then happens is that we kind of get this temporal kind of density and fragmentation, because we're kind of multitasking, interleaving. We've got more things kind of going on, and the nature of rhythms becomes more overlapping, and so on. It was rather than technology creating free time and quality time, which is always one of the promises of technology, we often kind of feel more harried and more rushed and more anxious and so on. And this is something we talked about quite a lot in our book on slow computing. And it also kind of seems that the rate of change is kind of accelerated as new technologies come along. So city infrastructure is constantly being updated. It's often in kind of beta forms, and is it's designed to be replaced over time rather than being there for long periods. And there's a sense in which the city starts to become disconnected from kind of natural, social, and clock time, and starts to be organized around network time and the time of these kind of technologies. And of course, ironically, the way in which smart city technologies work is they're kind of accelerating and fragmenting everyday life, but they're also then pitched as the solution to that fragmentation. So there are means to measure, manage, and cope with such processes. So our solution to these technologies, kind of making us feel harried and rushed and anxious, is to adopt more technologies that are meant to ameliorate that, but often don't. Another one of these kind of temporal relations that have been kind of altered is kind of time-space convergence. So this is a kind of shrinkage in time taken to communicate or travel between locations. Now, technology has been playing a long role in this. We can go back into the 18th, 19th century and look at the introduction of trains and the telegraph and electricity and all kinds of technologies that also kind of altered the kind of the space-time compression. But this is also, so even, Karl Marx, writing in the 19th century, talks about these technologies annihilating space by time. But of course, network technologies really massively compress, so the idea that I'm sat in my office here giving a talk to you, and you're all differentially located as well, is an example of this kind of radical space-time compression, where we've got kind of simultaneous communication across multiple places. And so there's kind of time-space dissociation going on, and a synchronicity between places, so I can kind of manage and control kind of what's happening. I mean, I kind of have user rights on this Zoom call, and I can mute you or unmute you, for example. So I have some level of temporal arbitrage, some level of control to alter people's relations at a distance. And this kind of real timeness produced through the internet during the late 1990s and early 2000s led to a kind of a new kinds of theory around this. So we had kind of new ideas around timeless time introduced by Manuel Castells, instantaneous time by John Urry, and network time by Robert Hassan. But they're all around this notion of, time space being kind of suspended, or this notion of simultaneously present or real time or on demand, that kind of globally connected, and so on. So time and space seems to be radically reconfigured, and it's enabling all kinds of temporal arbitrage to take place. Often where you see temporal arbitrage in the literature around India is around this kind of network work with places like Bangalore and so on, doing large amounts of kind of network labor at a distance from Europe or North America, and sometimes their local times being organized around those kind of times in the global north to kind of coordinate work and so on. So these technologies, network technologies, are enabling all kinds of temporal arbitrage, both locally and globally. And they're also enabling kind of new forms of kind of fast urbanism. So, these technologies are kind of speeding up the ways in which planning systems work, the ways in which finances operate. And so global finance systems are obviously operating at kind of speed of light, and money can transfer in and out of different schemes very quickly. So we have kind of rapid urbanization, speeding up optimization of development, kind of fast policy happening, policy being shifted around the globe, so kind of mobile policy. And we have speed being a strategy of accumulation. And Iona Datta's work has been very influential around this, looking at the notion of the developmental state. So the state being a key actor in the development cycle, kind of enabling planning, reducing bureaucracy, actually acting as co-investors and putting state money into schemes, but also speculative urbanism. So the finance sector, global finance, moving around, investing into places, then selling on assets, moving on into other places. And so, the speed, the turnover time of real estate is kind of linked into this kind of profit making. So this kind of speculative urbanism going on. And cities see this as a kind of a way to kind of fast track, to future proof, to leapfrog social and economic development, and has led to the notions of the instant city. So there's kind of three cities here. Is just Shenzhen, which had a population of 59,000 in 1980, had a population of 11.9 million in 2018. This is very much the instant city. This is a city that's growing at 400,000 people a year. Dubai in the middle, another city that's had massive amounts of speculative finance go into it, had a population of about 400,000 in 1990, 2.8 million in 2018. And then Quilamba in Angola, which is a kind of Chinese investment money into creating a new city in Angola. And in fact, this is actually pretty much a ghost city. Most of this is actually unoccupied because it's too unaffordable for locals there, including the emerging middle class. And these are other examples of this kind of fast urbanism happening. This is on the left-hand side is Masdar, kind of early development, how it's looking now. Songdo in South Korea. This is 2003. The land for this didn't even exist. So this is reclaimed land from the sea. This is it today. There's about 150,000 people live there. And then this is also going on in parts of North America and other places. This is Hudson Yards in New York. This is a few years ago. This is it now. This is the largest real estate development in the US in the last few years. It's done as a smart city development. This is full of sensors and all kinds of smart city technology embedded into Hudson Yards. But very, very rapid urbanization. And then just to move down to the last kind of bit of my table earlier on around temporal modality. So this is really about the kind of relationship between the past, the present, and the future. And a lot of these smart city technologies are about, you know, those kinds of relations. So some of it is about looking at the past. So you'll see I'll use the terms past, present, future present, and present future, which is really from Barbara Adams' work. And that's to recognize that we can only ever see these things from the present. So we personally only ever understand the past from our position in the present now, and we only understand the future from our position now. And one way of kind of thinking about these kind of modalities is just to think about, you know, like hindcasting, nowcasting, forecasting, and backcasting. So, you know, the past present is, you know, building a kind of a model how the past worked. Nowcasting is understanding the present in real time, in the now. Forecasting is trying to predict what will happen in the future, and backcasting is we have a desired future and we try to work back to the present future to work out how we would get there. So if we kind of think a bit about the past, present, and smart city technologies in relation to this, you know, there's a long history of urban data being generated as ways to kind of understand and manage cities. And a lot of that data ends up in archives and in repositories. And that's one of the evidence bases that we use to try and understand what's happened in the past, and, you know, to manage in the present and then to plan for the future. Now that data traditionally has been sampled. It's been temporally sampled and it's been spatially sampled. So it might be a census every 10 years, or it might be relating to one particular neighborhood or one particular place, and so on. But all of these smart city technologies are now producing archives of real-time data. And some of those systems that have been there for a while, we now have kind of 10, 15, 20 years worth of data in very fine granularity, down to the level of second, down to the level of individual sensors and individual locations. And that provides us with a new kind of richer database of historical data to kind of understand the past present, that allows us to kind of run models, to run simulations, to look at optimization, to do big data analytics, both to understand the past, but to also think about the present and think about the future. And obviously, as time moves on, those databases become a lot richer. We're also in the process of digitizing huge amounts of past data, you know, so digitizing, you know, whether it's newspaper stories or statistical office data or scientific data or whatever kind of data it is. So we're getting much more richer digital archives, and we can bring digital tools and the power of computation onto that data to better understand the past and to use that data to project forward. We also kind of, you know, this notion of the present and our kind of understanding of the present, you know, our life kind of increasingly kind of operates in this kind of perpetual presence of being kind of always in the instance of always on, everywhere available. And often we ourselves are quite fixated on the now and what's happening in the present. So we're constantly checking for new emails and responding, looking at for the current news or the weather, watching real-time news, browsing the newest post on social media and commenting or seeing whether people liked or responded, checking into places on located media, looking for real-time information on buses, checking quantified performance metrics, and so on. So one of the reasons why smartphones are quite powerful is, people are kind of compelled to check their Twitter 50 times a day, or their Facebook, or their Instagram, or their WhatsApp, or whatever it might be. And the appeal of these kind of a lot of smart city technologies is the operation in the real time, taking account of present conditions. So we know what's happening now, and we can act in relation to that. So we have the continuous generation of data across network sensors, actuators, transponders, cameras. They're fed back into control rooms for various forms of automated management. So the power of computation to be able to automate responses to that data, with systems where humans are either in, on, or off the loop. And these systems are trying to kind of maintain normal conditions, but also to respond immediately to exceptional circumstances, to try and correct them before they get out of control and they grow and they multiply. So this is about real-time management, very much in the now, real-time kind of management. And that, that is part of this kind of nowcasting, predicting the present, the very near future, so, a few seconds to a few days. So, weather forecasts are normally a few hours to a few days. The traffic we're normally trying to predict in the next 2 to 5 minutes through to the next half an hour. So traffic management is seeking to project really short-term traffic flows. Predictive policing is trying to nowcast patterns of crime, typically within the next 8 to 12 hours to direct police patrols and so on. So the power of these systems, as Emma Upprichard says, is it's not, the aim isn't simply to know now, but to know about now before now has happened. So there's a notion of kind of preemption, anticipation, and so on. And these systems kind of work to kind of cast the present by iteratively prefiguring it through ongoing responses. So we're always trying to kind of cast how the traffic system is going to work by almost trying to prejudge what's going to happen and alter the phasing of the traffic lights to make sure that doesn't happen and that the system continues to flow as it's meant to flow. We also have the kind of present future. So this is our kind of forecast. So we've got our historical data, we've got our data from the present, and we want to say, well, what do we think is going to happen in a year or in 5 years or in 10 years? We can do our kind of urban master plans and so on. But the present future is very much predicted from here. So we're looking forward from the present. And so smart city technologies in that sense are kind of used to produce two kinds of futures: contingency futures and optimization futures. So their contingency futures are trying to prepare for plausible and preferable scenarios or anticipated surprises. And optimization futures is about trying to optimize patterns and trends through prediction models and then to reconfigure the system to account for them and so on. And because they're trying to forecast and then make those forecasts happen, they're producing latent futures. They're futures in the making that are on the way and have yet to surface and become visible. And obviously a lot of the kind of smart city plans in India about these future cities and developments that are underway are about latent futures. There are blueprints, there are master plans, there is a future there that's to be realized. And the future is in the process of happening from those kind of predictions and forecasts. And often in the ways that in the past two speakers I kind of showed don't actually play out as anticipated, and things don't quite go in the way that people would like for lots of different reasons. And then the future present is really trying to use the future as a way to rethink the present. So it's often some normative future, some state that we want to achieve, like a climate neutral city or a kind of more fair, just notion of a city, and then work backwards to the present to work out what path would be needed to realize that future. And smart city advocates draw extensively on future scenarios like population change, like climate change, like fiscal austerity, and so on, as a way to try and shift things in the present. So to kind of rationalize technological interventions now, to preempt and plan new trajectories, to justify their investment and in their vision and in their products. So this is the future doing work in the present. And that those scenarios are real fictions in the sense that they're not just speculation, because people are actually acting on them. People are acting on the basis of these future scenarios to try and make them be realized and to make them come into being. And then lastly, if we just kind of summarize some of this up, so there's a whole range of different kind of temporalities here. This is and I've kind of talked about most of them in some way. This is taken from my notes of a talk given by Datta. I was discussing on it. These were the notes that I made. Now she's written quite a lot about time, And in some ways, these two parts of the table actually talk to Arumia's talk, where she did a little bit kind of about the post-colonial versus the smart. So Iona was talking about Shimla and smart city development there. And she's kind of contrasting the kind of the temporalities, the space times really of the projected smart city as opposed to the area where the smart city is going to be built. You know, so on the left-hand side, we have things like network time, real time, national and global time are being connected into this global community. It's about speed and acceleration. It's the instantaneous, it's the connected, it's time-space distanciation. It's modern, it's new, it's fast, it's the future is projected, it's efficient. The past is a resource that can be used for tourism and for other kinds of things. It's very much aimed at the kind of emerging middle class and the upper class. And it's, it has a kind of a logic around ordered, technocratic, predictive control. Whereas the other part of the city is kind of still on clock time, it is cyclical time, natural time, it's local times. It's seen as being delayed and congested and slow. It's embedded and grounded, it's broken, disconnected, it's informal, it's slow urbanism, slow violence, slow justice. The future is demolition, regeneration, it's a different type of future. And the past is a hindrance, it's a blockage, it's stopping new development happening, and it's very much catering for a different kind of class of people, and its kind of logics are seen as being kind of unruly, it's bureaucratic, it's lacking discipline, and so on. So it's these kind of times, these kind of contrasting kind of times that I've been kind of looking at through the talk really, and trying to put time more kind of centrally focused as something that needs to be kind of analyzed within a smart city. So, kind of what I've been trying to do is, map the temporality of smart cities and detail the various ways in which smart cities are kind of mediating and are mediated by temporal relations, rhythms, and modalities. And I try to make the case that the smart city is acting as a space-time machine. It's actively trying to alter these relations and to produce a particular kind of spatial temporalities. I obviously made the case that temporality of the smart city is kind of quite multiple, very heterogeneous, it's dynamic, and these temporalities are not teleological. These are not kind of fated and have a very strong path dependency and so on, but they're contingent and they're relational and they're open to change, into rupture, into resistance, into alteration. And that's seen in the global north through things like the movement around slow urbanism, slow cities, kind of, and just kind of the notion of slow as a counterpoint to speed and acceleration and so on. And I guess my overall argument has been that we kind of need to pay a lot more attention to these kind of spatiotemporalities of the smart cities, and not just think of the space element and the geography element. And I'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kitchin, for that fantastic keynote address. Now I open up the floor for a conversation to happen. If anybody has to make a comment, pose a question, and raise your hand and do so. Or you can sort of put it up in the chat box if you so feel. You can write it in the chat box. In the meantime, when people are thinking about what they can, the kind of questions they can pose, I would like to ask a couple of, not ask really, but really make an comments that I would think would make it sitting from the global south and how we look from the global south to the phenomena of smart cities.
Mhm.
What is interesting is that when we first encountered technology, the idea of technology was, in the classical sense, following what Castell talks about, is about information. And where I still remember when in my growing up years, we were talking about information being knowledge. And the West, in particular, when we were talking about global South vis-a-vis the global North, one was talking about the control over information, making the global North much more developed than what it is in the global south. So when we look at smart cities through the prism of development, and I essentially pose this question because that's the kind of framing that we do in the global south. And I might say that my entire knowledge and exposure to smart cities has been the kind of manner in which we in the global south sort of tend to look at and conceptualize this. So moving from here, like we're still at where we are trying to marry the kind of information, but we've moved at a stage not just having access to information, but actually having access to information in a certain time frame. So the kind of technologies that we are sort of, you are sort of referring to, the kind of instantaneous city, not just instantaneous city, but the kind of network time that you're talking about is a kind of, networked overlappings, the idea of simultaneity, where one is not only moving from space to space, but one is also moving from time to time. And where each time sort of, it's not about the rhythm and the fragmentation of the rhythm, but the fragmented rhythms somewhere connecting with one another. And that is generally the idea that from the global south, we have of the global north, and the way, cities in the global north, or the smart cities in the global north, are sort of sort of being imagined as, and where if you look at the implementation that, or the imagination and the policy that seems to be being thought of, is kind of making that information available faster, creating that access, but at the same time creating that simultaneity. So my comment here is that, if you look at then is there a distinction between the global souths only in terms of how one is wanting to control time, or whether one is looking at this kind of suspended living, sort of to say, in a kind of time warp? So how would you position it in that sense? Are we moving towards a kind of time warp, or are we moving towards a kind of suspended living, or are we looking at movements within time, but within a restricted kind of a space?
Oh God, it's a big question. I mean, I'm going to be really honest here, right, and say, like, I'm not a scholar of the global south, and I don't study the global south, and I very particularly don't write about the global south because I don't. And as you know, there's a whole politics about people in the global north writing about things that they really don't know about because they don't experience it or have deep knowledge of it. All of my work basically is on Ireland and bits of the UK and bits of North America, particularly Boston. I do think, though, that from reading bits of the literature, that there is quite a different emphasis on what smart cities are doing in different places. A lot of this technology in the global north is really about efficiency and optimization, about instrumentality. It's about technocratic governance. It's a little bit around economic development and so on. So in Dublin, Smart Dublin as an organization is very much about new economic opportunities. So we have 5 testbed districts in the city. We allow startup companies and multinational companies to deploy technologies in real places as a way of developing those technologies, which they might export somewhere else. So there's a bit around economic development. There's a bit about trying to managing the city more efficient. Whereas, my impression of what's happening in India is this is much more linked into development and a kind of urban transition which is not really what's happening here. You know, like it's we might have kind of upgrading of existing places, but it's not about you know, rapid, you know, fast urbanization. It's not about a kind of an urban transition of you know, massive infrastructural investment, new build, new housing, new office, all that kind of stuff. So it's playing a different kind of role. It's kind of, you know, here it's managing existing cities. There it's some of it's about redeveloping or regenerating parts, but also it's actually about whole new developments. And there obviously is these kind of interrelations between, you know, particularly around, I think, around the finance. So if you have a look at some of the kind of financialization around some of the Indian smart cities, this is global finance. This is money coming in from London, New York, Tokyo, Singapore, and so on. It's touching down in India for maybe 2 or 3 years, and then their investment is being sold on to somebody else, who's then coming in for a different part of the development cycle, who will do it for a couple of years, and then the money will go somewhere else. And so you see this kind of capital kind of shifting in, shifting out very rapidly. Now that's going on in Ireland at the minute, right? So, you know, a lot of housing in Ireland at the minute is being developed by global multinational companies who are developing new estates and then selling them on and moving off, and it's not being done by local business and so on. So you could have money come into Ireland, then go off into India for 6 months or a year, and then move to Singapore, and then move to Kamala in Africa. You know, this is this is this kind of thing. So the kind of the time frame there is speeding up in terms of the kind of turnover rate of capital. There's a kind of a time element involved in there. And in terms of you kind of going on your point around kind of information knowledge, I mean, a lot of this is actually just about information. You know, the traffic control room is really not about knowledge. It's about data into information, acting on it, and move very rapidly. This is not. It's a kind of it's data driven. It's just acting on the data. Whereas the knowledge part of it would be more kind of, I guess, around kind of policy and around you know. So again, you would have kind of I think fast policy going on, and these kind of transfers of knowledge. You know, so a lot of my impression of some of the Indian smart cities is a lot of the knowledge base is actually coming from consultancies in London or in Japan or in Singapore, and they're often in collaboration with companies in those places. And so you're getting relatively fast transfers of policy in and out. And that's maybe where the knowledge thing is kind of happening, along with, you know, because they're often local branches of those companies who are implementing it in the local sense. And the same thing's kind of happening in parts of China where there is a speed element involved. So all these kind of master plans are normally done on a kind of 14-week cycle. And again, they're almost like cookie cutting existing blueprints, and they're bringing in design consultancies from outside and so on. I'm not sure I really answered your question really in relation to the temporalities. I think one of the things you have to remember is you're kind of caught in these multiple temporalities, you know, and it's never just local. It's always kind of up, you know. So I can be kind of walking along the street, coming up to a set of traffic lights. I can be on the phone to somebody in Australia, or I could be, you know, answering an email or something. I press a button on the traffic lights, and I'm in multiple times simultaneously. You know, I'm in this global time of being connected to Australia. I'm in a local time of where I am. I'm in the network time of the traffic control system and the phasing of the traffic lights. I'm simultaneously in multiple space times. I'm not just in one. And I think that's, you know, one of the differences now is that kind of, traditionally you would have been in one or the other, whereas now you can be in multiple, scaled across the globe, you know, which is what's happening now with this call. Sorry, you're still on mute.
We have some Kanchana who has raised her hand. Kanchana, would you unmute yourself and since you raised your hand, Kanchana? Yes, Kanchana.
I can answer the question about place if you like while you wait. So there's a question there about, you know, time being so fluid and flexible and all the space-time compression, what will happen to place? Well, nothing much really, to be honest. Like it was always one of the fallacies of the internet. You know, the early internet was, you know, there was this whole thing around you know, the role of space would disappear, you know, that you know, we kind of live in this global present and so on. But actually that never came to pass, because, you know, what happens is you get some places that will take advantage of those relations and they become more kind of important. So, you know, what actually happened with the first round of networked urbanism is some places got agglomeration and became more powerful command and control centers, and things kind of moved there at the same time, while things went to back offices and went, you know, to the edge of cities, or they went to other places, or they went, you know, they went overseas. And so you had a reorganization. But place remained important, right? It remained important for people's identity. Spatial relations still remained important because, you know, things still have to move. There's still logistics, there's still cost of transport, there's still cost of labor that you know, you can take advantage of forms of temporal arbitrage or spatial arbitrage, and so on. So place always remains important. The key thing though is the way in which place might change, and the nature in which place might change. So one of the changes that might that's certainly been experienced here, I'm not sure what it's like there, is the nature of home is changing, and the relationship of home is changing because most people now are working at home. There's a large number of people who are working. You know, for the last couple of years, they've been enforced to work at home. And the university here is going to change because, you know, people are now used to working at home and teaching online and doing things. Like most people are now only coming in on the days they teach. Used to be they came in every day. You know, so that kind of relationship between the nature of home and the experience of work and home being simultaneously the same place, and also the nature of the relationship between home and work, is altering. And one of the things that actually happened over the last couple of years here is people have moved. There's a number of people in my department who've moved 80, 100 miles away from the university, whereas they used to all live locally. And so they've all moved to where they can afford housing, because it's too expensive to afford housing here. So you know, the nature of the place will change through those kinds of things.
Rishika, you have raised your hand. Would you like to pose your question, please? Rishika?
Yes, hi. Thank you, sir, for the really fascinating presentation, always inspired by your work. And somebody who has lived kind of in between spaces from global south to now north, there's this word brokenness in the last slide, where you are drawing in from Datta's work on subaltern city, and how there's a fragmentation and kind of disconnect between this new smart city and the space which has been left behind in the kind of older part of the city or the city core. So there's this term brokenness, but I'm really intrigued. Would you like to reflect on how this temporal flexibility in global north now, this multiplicity of time, and how it has been fragmented through the technological control to make us more productive, how it has made us also broken and vulnerable to time? So it's this notion of brokenness. Yeah, thank you.
So in our book on slow computing, we have a couple of chapters specifically on that. So we kind of talk about the ways in which you know, we can kind of time can become fragmented, or we can become kind of harried or rushed or under time pressure, or, we can have these kind of effects of temporal arbitrage where we're being kind of exploited through temporal relations because time-space dissociation. We also have some people who are kind of not necessarily fully in the network world. They don't have a smartphone. They're not necessarily doing digital work. They're not connected onto the internet. So there's a kind of unevenness around that. And then there's an unevenness about how relations are imposed on people through governance and through governmentality, which kind of particularly came to light through COVID and things around restrictions on movement and who could and couldn't move, and how location of movement was being tracked, and kind of travel permissions and enforced quarantines, lockdowns, and then how that was differentially applied to different populations and so on. So you can kind of have effects across different populations because of their kind of, their kind of socioeconomic status and so on, or their access to technologies, or what's kind of in a particular kind of place. If, for example, where I live at home, I don't have broadband, so I connect by mobile phone. That's how I connect to the internet, is by mobile phone. And that was a big problem for a lot of our students during lockdown when we were trying to do, I've got a colleague who used to drive to the local hotel and piggyback onto their Wi-Fi. That was the only way he could do. He used to give all his lectures from the car park because that was the only way he could do it, so there's kind of differentiated kinds of things, and then the impact on our everyday life, and whether you're involved in these kind of temporal pressures. So a good example of that would be around the gig economy. So people who are working on the gig economy in various kinds of precarious kinds of work, maybe on 0-hour contracts, maybe just having to respond to the gigs when and where they want, right? So that kind of places pressure on family life and all other kinds of things because of the precarity kind of involved. So yeah, there are all kinds of uneven kinds of effects, and Iona's work is very good. If you're interested in time in relation to smart cities in the Indian context, she's got 4 or 5 papers kind of looking at this, looking at kind of legacy of post-colonial time, or kind of looking around discourses around mythological time and how it gets layered in, around kind of gendered time and how different social groups, particularly young women, might experience temporal effects through kind of smartphones and curfews and other kinds of things. Some of the work around Shimla around this kind of comparing the area that's going to become a smart city with the notion of what the smart city will be. And she has very strong temporal kinds of ideas running through that, and the contrasts and the discontinuities, or the where the kind of paradoxes, I guess, of how it affects different places and different people differentially. Yeah, I'm not sure if I really answered the question there, but there's lots of it going on. And then in the book, what we do is we try to then give advice for how you can ameliorate this, taking account of the fact that not everybody has good control over their time. So, I'm a kind of a full professor in the university, and I have reasonable control over my time, over my timetable and how I schedule things and so on. But other people don't, and they're working to a boss and they don't have a lot of control and so on. But there are things that you can try and do to take back control. But really the big thing is collective action. You can carve out a little bit of agency around yourself, but really you need structural social change to address things. So an example of that in the European context would be the right to disconnect. So this has been a movement where, and it's now law in France and Italy, for example, that you don't have to answer email after 5 o'clock. You don't have to answer the phone after 5 o'clock from your boss. You don't have to answer anything at the weekends. That you have the right to disconnect. So that's collective action. That doesn't come through individual intervention.
In fact, it's an interesting contrast, if I may comment on it here, the right to disconnect. In India, it's completely different, where one is basing it on the right to connect rather than disconnect. And where the entire idea of us as an emerging nation and a world power emerges from this idea of, being able to beat the West in particular, with the way we are working, with the way we are connecting with one another. So if you look currently, if I may use the language, the common language that we use is we use the word FOMO, the fear of missing out, where being disconnected means that you're going to miss out. You're going to miss out on opportunities. You're going to miss out on information. You're going to miss out on something which is out there for you to grab on and hold on and to move ahead. So I think from the Indian context, the entire idea of smartness has been sort of a strategy and a vehicle to move forward in terms of establishing itself, not just as one of the powers and to move forward in the development cycle, but also somewhere along the line, this kind of colonial mindset that we have. I mean, having been a country which has been colonized for about 200 and 250 odd years, where often we have been pointed out that there is a certain laziness, there is a certain inefficiency, which all is connected to the idea of slowness. So technology here affords us this kind of fastness, which was not there. So hence this obsession with digitalizing, this obsession with using technology, and this obsession, particularly you would find it within middle class and urban middle class, which is obsessed with the idea of actually connecting. So in many ways, the past 2 years, if you look at in the COVID period when one was all immobile and stuck at home, I mean, I can tell you from my own experience that my colleagues have been sending me emails and work around 11:30 in the night and expecting me to respond and finish it off in that particular night. This has happened. My fellow convener here, Professor Ashish Shah, did exactly that. So, and there was no complaint on our sides. We were actually doing that kind of work, and where the rhythms in our life was, there was no day, there was no night. And the whole idea was to express this. It gave us actually it gave us an opportunity to establish our efficiency, and that has remained very dominant in this whole idea of using digital technologies. So it's an interesting contrast that comes out.
I mean, we would have some kind of parallels with that, right? I mean, Ireland is a post-colonial country as well. We had 700 years of occupation, and so we have a partly post-colonial mindset. And we were, if you think back to the history of the country, we were traditionally very poor. So we were the poorest country in the European Union, and in 1987. By 2000, we were the second richest country in Europe, and it was all off of digital, right? So digital and pharmacy, basically, they were the two big areas. And we never industrialized. So we went from agriculture to services in kind of one leap. There's no industrial, if you come here, you won't see old derelict factories because there weren't any. So we went through a very rapid, and we still have the same kind of tropes around, slowness and whatever, and that still exists. So like that would still the kind of I guess the kind of the character or the notion of national tropes or whatever would kind of still be there at the same time as we're working in a very post-industrial kind of society where we kind of leapfrogged up, like over 50% of our housing, for example, has been built in the last 20 years. Like it's been a very big turnaround. Like our population's gone up by 35%, partly through inward migration and so on. So there's been huge transformation in like urban landscape and redevelopment and all of that kind of stuff has been going on. But at the same time, some of that colonial thing lingers. So some of the thing around, say, like surveillance. So, you know, in the traffic control room in Dublin, the traffic cam, the surveillance, it's just there and gone. None of it's recorded. And when we interview the people there about, well, you know, wouldn't it be useful if you had some of it on, you know, so if you go and you say, my car was stolen yesterday, can I see the footage? They just say, no, we don't have it. And when we asked them about it, they just said, like, we live here, and why would we want surveillance? We're not interested in surveillance. Like, so that's a legacy of surveillance from British rule. And so, like, there's no culture of that here. It's a different kind of view, you know. But the connected thing, I think the connected thing here has always been more around network and diaspora and connection in a people sense, not, you know, so I guess some of the technology is facilitating that kind of work. But again, it's very informal. It's all about informal relations. It's not about formal relations. And that's a legacy of kind of institutional structural thing. It was always about the family and about the community and using those connections, and there's a kind of inbuilt clientelism within that, you know. So that's kind of off the side answer there, really. But I do think, like, one of the key things to recognize around all of this, and if you look at different case studies everywhere, is there's very the specificities depending on where you are, on what you're trying to use the technologies for. And, you know, so in some places it's about security and safeness, some places about economic development, in other places it's about urban development and or regeneration, in other places. So there's a very, like in the UK, smart cities is actually all about export market and about global opportunity for business and whatever, you know. So there are different kind of flavors or ambitions as to how these kind of get grounded and used. And even with things like cultures around, you know, how we use the smartphones and what we use them for and so on. I can tell you now that nobody was answering emails at 11 o'clock at night here. That was definitely not happening.
We have two more questions on the chat.
And nobody was asking either.
We have two more questions on the chat box. So perhaps this would be the last two we would take in. One is from Kanchana, who has written, how do the smart cities of global north address the accessibility issues of persons with visual impairment?
Oh, well, not very well, basically. Like, there are, like, I mean, part of the problem around a lot of this technology, around how it's framed in relation to citizens, is it's always been framed in relation to a particular kind of figure, you know. So it's, you know, it's the kind of white middle class, middle-aged, able-bodied figure is the dominant figure around which most of this technology is based. There's been very little work really looking at all of the various kinds of things, whether it's disability or race or gender or sexuality or, you know, class or whatever it might be. There's been very little, and there's been a number of studies now who kind of looked at, you know, how citizens are envisaged and included, and, you know, how, you know, like Taylor Shelton's work around this kind of general and absent citizen and so on. And so there's been relatively little around disability other than within those people kind of working on that. So, I mean, there's a long history around visual impairment going back into the 1990s, trying to use GPS and so on. So it tends to be, I think, more at the level of the smartphone app and so on, as opposed to kind of city municipalities kind of systematically working through some of those kind of issues around universal design and inclusion and so on. So yeah, it's mostly based around, I think, smartphone kind of apps to do kind of route direction stuff. There used to be a play on trying to use beacons and all of that kind of stuff. You know, you'd put the beacons up with an audio array, and then you would kind of move through the cones of sound and so on. But my impression is that hasn't actually got very far, because it necessitates large scale infrastructural spend. Whereas the smartphone, if you've got a smartphone, it's at the level of personal technology.
So we have another question from Ayushi Bengani. She says, besides disconnecting individually or collectively, how can we reclaim time?
Oh, yeah. So it's partly around things like trying to come to agreements with people around things like scheduling around. So some of this can be done at the family level, some of it can be done with community stuff, some of it can be done through labor, through labor unions. Some of it's done through talking to political parties or and so on. So it's about thinking about so there's a whole number of these kind of slow movements around slow food, slow tourism, slow work, slow whatever. So some of it's, it's been around this notion of slowness, which is kind of capturing a kind of a range of different things. I mean, partly at the personal level, it's about trying to be more kind of almost going back to clock time or being more ordered or carving out time for particular things, like you're going to have a meal time and it's not going to be disturbed with everybody looking at their smartphone through it. And that can be done. It can be done anything through gamifying it through to, just agreements. The game I like is if you go to a restaurant with people, then everybody puts their phone in a stack in the middle of the table and the first person to pick up the phone pays. That usually keeps the smartphone out of the thing. The only time you can answer it is if it's the babysitter, but otherwise it stays where it is. So it's that kind of thing. But I'll have to try and maybe I can send you a link to something that might give you a bit more. There's a range of these kind of things. Like the slow city movement has. You can sign up on, it's called Sit Slow, and cities sign up to it, and they sign up to a set of principles, and the set of principles relate to everything from kind of social, city services, work things, and companies and so on sign up to the set of principles around what they're going to do. And it's partly about it's partly about place and about reclaiming place and reclaiming kind of community stuff and so on. And claiming for time for old traditions and all of that kind of thing. But they actually have, like, I don't know, I think there's 72 principles you have to sign up to. Like there's loads of them, right? So it's never just one thing. So like the right to disconnect is just one thing of a whole series of these kind of various kind of interventions, which can be anything from personal through to. So Italy, for example, has a whole series of urban time policies. And most municipalities have an office of time management, if you like, which is all about coordinating opening times of city services against working times. It was all about, trying to get coordination of the buses meeting at the right times and the trains meeting at the right times, and coordination of business opening times against school times to try and allow enough time. So there was a whole series. Been a whole effort to try and make people, I guess, kind of time rich rather than time poor by coordinating at a city scale how things are organized.
So thank you, Professor Kitchin. I think we're well in time. It's almost 4:30 Indian Standard Time. Thank you for graciously agreeing to come in and our keynote address, where we really learned a great deal firsthand. It's always, another thing reading you, and it's another thing listening to you. So, and it's, it was wonderful learning experience, just not for me, I think for all the participants here, to really have a look into how the smart city in itself is kind of conceptualized and visualized in the West. As often in the global South, we consider it to be a Western concept, which is seemed to be at times being forced down a bit down our throat, rather than us organically coming with it ourselves. And or even if it comes, it's very nuanced, where we sort of there is a negotiation and different kind of negotiation that takes place with technology and how we use it and how we implement it. And obviously you were there for the last session where we were really raising issues about anxiety and agency of not all the stakeholders here, not just the people or people in technology, for so to speak, but even for the government agency to implement the idea of technology through smart cities and for developmental interventions. You bring up interesting ideas of how the smart city encompasses the idea of time and traveling through time, and sort of talks about rhythms of the city, where it sort of makes way for a kind of an optimization or a kind of an efficiency logic to it, which brings about, and very frankly speaking, it reminded me of my a week stay in Tokyo, where what was interesting was that everything was minuted down, whether it was the train service or whether it was the bus timing, everything was coordinated and minuted down to the bare second of it. And if it didn't happen according to that particular programmed timing, then people would actually apologize for it. So that was an interesting kind of an experience in coming from the global south, where we do not really sort of encounter this. And it's interesting how also from your context, which was quite interesting, which we could connect it actually sitting from India, is also to think how notions of time are socially constructed, and so our relationships with technology, given the kind of pasts that we have, our political and social histories that we have, in terms of our colonial encounters that we've had, where we also look at time and the claiming and reclaiming of time, the slowness or the fastness of it, and how we have associated that slowness and fastness with either development or with technology. And somehow the slowness and fastness seems to be synchronized and synonymous with either being advanced or developed or being ahead, if I may loosely use those words to put together the way we sort of look at, the entire conceptualization of smart cities, so to speak. So thank you so much, Professor Kitchin, for agreeing to come in. It was wonderful hearing to you, and it was a great learning experience for us. Thank you so much.
Yes, great. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you.